Hello fellow Romanov lovers. Today we're going to cover the topic of Romanov passion for flowers. If you like the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel. Now that we're done with that, we can dive into this topic. There have been many stories told concerning the Romanovs and their love of flowers. Their fabulous parties at the Winter Palace, with groves of fragrant blooming citrus trees and huge masses of flowers, were legendary. It was not only the size, expense, and luxury of the floral display that impressed. Just one look outside the palace windows, and the snow and ice was proof of Russia's power. It seemed there was nothing the Romanovs could not do, even deny nature itself. Elsewhere in the Winter Palace, Catherine the Great strolled in her glass-roofed, hanging garden where flowers bloomed and birds sang to delight her and impress guests in January. One famous story about the last Empress Alexandra and flowers is an extravagant myth. It has been claimed that masses of expensive flowers were brought weekly by specially heated trains from the French Riviera to Tsarskoye Selo by imperial command for Empress's private pleasure. Considering their vast wealth, it is not surprising that people believed this story to be true, but almost all of Alexandra's flowers were grown in her own greenhouses. Although she was the richest woman in the world at the time, Alexandra was careful with her own expenses and made sure her accounts of her household were always in order. She always insisted on supplying the needs of the imperial greenhouses and farm whenever possible. For generations before Alexandra, the Russian imperial family had loved flowers. Catherine the Great treasured her roses in Tsarskoye Selo and had special guards assigned to protect them year-round from the harsh climate and accidents. Once an imperial order had been given, it was followed until rescinded. Over a century after Catherine died, Nicholas and Alexandra discovered a guard still stationed to protect a long-vanished rose of Catherine's. Maria Feodorovna, the wife of Paul I, had a famed garden of lilacs, roses and flowering plants that still exists outside her private rooms at Pavlovsk. Her son, Alexander I, sent roses from Josephine's garden to his mother, including the fragrant milky pink almond-colored Souvenir de la Malmaison, a bourbon named for the French Empress's famous estate known for its enormous rose garden. The famous Rose Pavilion at Pavlovsk was decorated by huge hanging gardens of silk roses. The imperious Nicholas I, a handsome man whose icy masculine good looks both mesmerized and frightened young Queen Victoria, was an intimidating ruler and yet an avid gardener as well. At the Alexander Palace, Nicholas would go off duty and indulge in private joys like planting flowering Dutch bulbs around the palace with his own hands. Nothing made him happier than receiving a parcel of new bulb varieties from his relatives abroad for his flower beds at the Alexander Palace. Alexander III gave his wife, the former Danish princess Maria Feodorovna, the gift of a rose garden alongside her rooms at the Alexander Palace. In the time of the Tsar, Nicholas II's children loved Granny's garden, which stood on the bank opposite their private island in the Imperial Park. Adults were not allowed to visit the island with the permission of the children. The children's island was the location of flower gardens of the Tsarevich and his sisters, and there were masses of lily of the valley, bouquet of which the children brought to their mother as gifts. Alexandra gave gifts of flowers, fruits, and plants from the greenhouses to her friends, servants, wounded soldiers, relatives, artists, and writers year round. They were delivered by servants in elaborate 18th century costumes. The Empress and her daughters also received dozens of bouquets every day from people and organizations all over Russia. These flowers, generally decorated with elaborate ribbons with inscriptions, were displayed on tables outside the rooms of the imperial family. If they wanted, they could take the arrangements of their choice into their rooms. Those left behind had their ribbons removed and were displayed in the rooms of the palace or sent to hospitals and churches in Tsarskoye Selo. Everyone who sent flowers to the imperial family received thank you messages and sometimes gifts in return. The Empress collected ribbons attached to flowers of special meaning and gathered them in her bedroom on a hook near the door to the mauve room. There was a special room in the basement of the palace where flowers were stored and arranged. Alexandra's personal florist made handwritten cards describing the flowers in the bouquet and baskets they created for the personal apartments of the family. The imperial gardeners grew the well-known roses of the time. The Empress especially liked the white hybrid perpetuals Frau Karl Dresky and the pink and richly fragrant Baroness Rothschild. Garden books and catalogues of plants from Russian garden centers and foreign suppliers were sent to the imperial family, and they were avid readers of them. They followed the latest trends in horticulture and ordered plants and seeds. Alexandra and the Dowager Empress Marie were patrons of the flower shows in Russia and abroad, even in England. Other members of the imperial family were patrons of flower shows and experimental greenhouses in Russia. The Tsarevich Alexei had a collection of cacti with the thorns carefully removed. In the early years of her married life, Alexandra spent a great deal of time in the gardens of the Alexander Palace, but her difficult pregnancies and illnesses confined her more and more in her rooms. This was not the only reason for her retreat into her private apartments. It was impossible for her to visit the park without elaborate preparations being made by palace officials and security guards. Alexandra, a shy and private person, felt extremely uncomfortable being watched or stared at by anyone. Any visit to the park meant police hidden throughout the park, observing her every move. The imperial family constantly complained about the presence of the police and their efforts to isolate them to no avail. Other greenhouses belonging to the imperial court were located in Tsarskoye Selo and were also established at other Romanov estates like Livadia in the Crimea. The oldest imperial greenhouses were designed by the Italian architect Quarenghi, who also designed the Alexander Palace. Alexandra erected a new modern greenhouse with the latest heating, watering and lighting system of the time near the palace. It had a huge arched glass roof that could accommodate the largest palms. These greenhouses were huge and by 1910 housed a huge collection of rare and beautiful plants and trees from around the world. Over the years, imperial gardeners had created a vast array of plants from all climates. There were fruit trees, palms of all sizes, berry patches, orchids, bulbs, peonies, flowering shrubs, big rubbery-leaved philodendrons, and hundreds of varieties of lilacs in all colors. Russian explorers hunted throughout the world for new types of lilacs and sent samples to the imperial greenhouses, where they were carefully nurtured into unique specimen plants. Alexandra had a special love of lilacs, and the color of the mauve room was created from a lilac branch the empress gave to her decorator, Roman Meltzer, to duplicate as the hue for the walls and silk fabrics in her private boudoir. Lilacs come in many colors, some have intense fragrance and others are known more for their unique flower form or shade. The imperial greenhouses were able to supply lilacs to the palace almost all year. However, the most beautiful, lush, and fragrant lilacs came from the imperial park itself, where huge lilac trees sunk under the weight of blossoms in early summer. The scene was overwhelming. In the far north, in Petersburg and Helsinki, lilacs possess an extra vigor and perfume because of the short growing season and long hours of sunlight during the days of the white nights. Beginning in April, the imperial gardeners brought branches from lilac trees in the park to the greenhouses where they forced early blooming, but they didn't have the size or fragrance of the naturally blooming flowers from the parks. Smaller lilacs, specially grown in pots in the greenhouses, were also brought into the palace when they came into bloom. The transportation of potted plants of all types from the greenhouses was an especially dangerous operation. Although the greenhouses were nearby, a rare tropical plant, indeed any plant, could freeze during transport in the winter months. To protect the plants as they were moved, special enclosures and heated wagons were created. Dozens of workers were sometimes required to move them. For great parties and events, huge palms, flowering citrus trees, and great blooming shrubs were brought into the palace. Once they left their transport, it was a challenge to get them into the palace. Once inside, moving the plants across the polished parquet floors and around expensive porcelain, gilded furniture, and treasured works of art could be a frightening experience. Once in place, all sorts of special care needed to be taken to protect the plants from changes in temperature, humidity, and people. Every great plant from the imperial greenhouses was treated by the imperial gardeners like children. In fact, some of the plants had been given names. Over the generations, stories were told about plants, their origins, and their history. In 1910, there were 150-year-old plants, what had first arrived in the greenhouses in the reign of Catherine the Great, that were still living and thriving.